各位朋友，大家下午好！欢迎各位参加由 Mentoring 导师学院和组织隐形技能管理全球智库 GO-TKM 联合主办的组织隐形技能管理大师系列讲座50场。今天是第21场，由来自英国的 Dave Snowden 教授主讲。他今天给我们分享的话题是如何通过讲故事和非正式渠道编制和管理隐性知识流程。首先，让我们来认识一下今天的演讲嘉宾。那 Dave Snowden 教授，他是知识管理领域非常著名的人物，他是 IBM 知识管理研究院的前院长，然后当时在 IBM 也创立了 CIFIN 组织复杂性中心，然后他是 CIFIN 管理决策框架的创始人，目前也是 CIFIN Code 的创始人兼首席执行官。他还是威尔士大学应用复杂性中心的创始人。他也曾经在多所高校担任客座教授，包括香港理工大学、英国的华威大学、赫尔大学等等。他是知识管理领域多家学术和从业者期刊的编委会成员，也是 ECO 的主编。曾经他跟别人合著的关于领导力的一篇文章，然后是当时的哈佛商业评论的封面文章。他也曾经因为在知识管理方面的独创性工作而获得了瑞典皇家科学院的特别奖。今天的讲座呢，是主办方是包括 Mentoring 以及 GO-TKM。Mentoring 是总部位于比利时布鲁塞尔的全球化导师服务咨询公司，业务遍及6大洲35个国家和地区。那 Mentoring 提供的导师技术课程、服务流程以及标准，还有服务团队都获得了欧洲导师教练协会的专业认证。Mentoring 中国是注册在上海的中欧合资企业，我们是在2019年的11月首次把欧洲导师技术正式引入中国。组织隐性技能管理全球智库 GO-TKM 是注册在比利时布鲁塞尔的非营利性国际智库。智库呢，旨在推动组织隐性技能管理在全社会的运用，推动人类的高效率学习。那现在我们把舞台交给我们今天的演讲嘉宾 Dave 先生。Now let's warmly welcome Prof.Dave Snowden.
Firstly, my thanks for the invitation to speak to you, and I hope this all works in a combination of English and Mandarin. I got involved in knowledge management way back in the 1990s, originally from a background in decision support systems. So I designed and wrote, in the early days of mainframe computers actually, systems to support companies like Guinness PLC and Maersk Shipping to make better decisions. And that really got me into the whole area about how do people make decisions, what's the balance between information, between experience, between heuristics, things I will come back to later and discuss. And then knowledge management came along with really triggered by Nanaka's famous book, The Knowledge Creating Company, which really triggered this whole issue of tacit and explicit knowledge. And the Seki model, which later became called BAR, effectively defined a generation. To be clear, I was one of the few people to be fundamentally opposed to the Seki model when it first came out. I thought it was a mistake from day one, to be honest. But the idea was we share tacit knowledge by conversation, by observation. We then write it down and it becomes explicit, and that's held to have more value. And then explicit knowledge is shared on databases and such like. And as that starts to come together, other people read that material, the explicit becomes tacit, and this was called the knowledge creation spiral. So the idea is knowledge goes through this spiral. Now, many of us at the time argued really strongly that this was an error, that there's a whole body of tacit knowledge which can never be made explicit. And that was really the early days of a focus on tacit knowledge and tacit knowledge management in organizations. So I've been working on that really since the 1990s, and subsequently in complexity theory and counterterrorism for the US government and a whole variety of areas. And what came out of that is 3 basic principles of knowledge management, which I'll now actually share. The first one is that knowledge is only ever volunteered, it can't be conscripted. You actually can't make people surrender their knowledge because you'll never know whether they've done it or not. You can force them to hand over information. If you know they have it, you can force them to comply with the process. But knowledge is a much more ephemeral thing. It's much more difficult to determine whether somebody is really doing it or not. And I remember when I worked in IBM, which I did for 7 years, the pioneering work I and others did on narrative, we only really shared with people we trusted. And if we were forced to make it explicit for some chief knowledge officer, we basically put minimal information down, or we put material which was quite frankly unintelligible until you came to talk with us. A lot of people misquote the famous knowledge is power thing. It's knowledge retention in experts is normally fear of abuse rather than power retention. And therefore, we're careful who we share that knowledge with it because it's part of our overall reputation. So that's principle number 1. Principle number 2, and I'm going to build on this a lot during the presentation, we only know what we know when we need to know it. So human knowledge is deeply contextual. It's stimulated by circumstances. If you ask people to write down what they know, then they'll just remember stuff relevant to the last few things they did. The reality is that we only remember things when we get this contextual trigger. There's a human phrase, let me sleep on it. If human beings are sleeping on something, they're engaged in a very complex series of neurological aspects of the short-term to long-term memory and memory recall. And you often wake up, refreshed, and you've suddenly worked out a solution to a problem. But it requires the initial question or the stimulus for you to remember things. So attempts to capture knowledge by asking people what they know effectively are a meaningless question in a meaningless context. Knowledge is always contextual. And the third one, and again, I'm going to build on this extensively, this is an adaptation of Polanyi's famous statement, we always know more than we can say. And I extended that to say we will always say more than we can write down. So the process of taking something from my consciousness, into my mouth, in spoken word, in oral history, into written material using my hands, involves a serious loss of content, but also critically a loss of context. And that leads us into talking about different types of knowledge, other than just tacit and explicit. We need to think about how we transfer or how we transit between tacit and explicit knowledge. And I'm going to talk about that extensively in a minute. And by the way, that is an adaptation of a quote by Polanyi. Nanaka references Polanyi, but he seems to forget that a key thing Polanyi said is that no explicit knowledge can ever exist without a tacit component. So the idea that you can render your tacit knowledge explicit is a problem. Now, I remember a CEO of Hewlett-Packard famously said, our tacit knowledge, our knowledge walks out the door every night. And that was used as a justification for huge programs on codification. And I and others at the time said, well, why don't you just focus on getting it to walk back in through the door the next day and to create apprentice schemes so we get knowledge transfer? That will be a lot cheaper. But the big thrust in knowledge management, really from the 90s and continuing into the modern day, has been codification, information databases, using AI to search text, and text is about 10% of what we can know, so it's limited by definition. We really need a much more flexible approach to understanding knowledge. And we need something to reference computers, which recognizes that silicon is not the same thing as carbon. The way that human beings make decisions is radically different from the way that computers make decisions, and we can use computers to augment human intelligence, but not really to replace it. And this kind of led into something which I call the tyranny of the explicit. I mean, the famous phrase, the match is not the territory. I spend, my hobbies are long distance cycling and long distance endurance walking. There is a huge difference between the abstracted map and the reality of a mountain. And if you're going to walk a mountain with a map without experience, you could get lost, you could get damaged. There's far more to understanding something than abstracted knowledge into codified form. And the other thing on this, by the way, is that anything explicit will always be gamed in some way or other by human beings. It lacks the essential ambiguity of human acts of knowing. We use ambiguity quite deliberately, and it has a key part in our evolutionary history. If you look at the various sacred texts, whether you go to Taoism, Confucianism, Christianity, you go to the Indian canon of stories, you'll find that those stories still have relevance today, even though they come from a different period, because they actually don't spell things out too much. They're not too explicit. They carry what we call necessary ambiguity, and that allows a degree of adaptability into different circumstances. Now, this concept in the map comes back to something I worked on with Max Boisseau, and his book Knowledge Assets is one of the classics of the field. It has been written into Chinese. He actually set up the first Chinese business school in Beijing. So there's a body of work by Max Boisseau in Mandarin, which I strongly recommend you seeking out. And what we ended up with, and this was an adaptation in his iSpace, is effectively a grid which looks in the vertical dimension at abstraction. So that's the degree to which you have abstract symbols. Yeah. So if you look at a map, there are symbols which represent marsh, forest. There are symbols for paths, for footways, for roads. Those are called abstractions. They're levels of abstraction, which once you learn what they mean, can contain complex knowledge. Military environments use symbols all the time in terms of very rapid decision-making in the field. And then we have increasing levels of codification, i.e. making things explicit. Now, at one extreme of that, we have the map and map users, the thing I talked about before. So a map is highly codified. It uses high levels of abstraction. Picking up and knowing how to use a map is actually relatively quick. It's relatively cheap. It's hugely valuable. So nothing wrong with that. It has value. At the other end of the spectrum, we have knowledge which is not abstracted, which isn't codified, which is fundamentally based on experience. And here, the famous example on this is the London taxi driver. And, we train taxi drivers in London. They spend 2.5 years, sometimes longer, driving around the streets of London, which is one of the largest cities in the world, with a medieval structure in parts. And they have to know the name of every street and every major landmark. And the exam is to be given 2 points in London and describe the route out and the route back from memory, mentioning every turn and every landmark, every hotel that you pass en route. Nobody's done it in less than 2 years. And one of the reasons for that is it only has a 40% pass rate, by the way, over multiple attempts. The reason is that the hippocampus in the brain has to physically change structure to accommodate that level of knowledge in the human. If you want another metaphor for this, it's the native guide. Last time I was in Beijing, I took the chance to go to walk the Great Wall, and I had a guide, and really interesting guy. We talked a lot as we walked, and he knew the wall backwards. And once he realized that I was capable of walking more than 5 miles a day on the tourist section, we went on to some very interesting, very decayed, but fascinating areas of the wall, because he knew I was competent to do it. Now, he knew things about that path which couldn't be written in the guidebooks. I had the guidebooks, I had the maps, but I didn't have the same capability of that guy who walked it all his time as a job, and who understood it and understood its history and understood the needs of different people in different contexts. And that is, in fact, is what tacit knowledge is, which is heavily based on experience. Now, the danger with maps is maps can be powerful, but they don't adapt very readily to context. And one of the things I often ask when I'm working with companies on this is it a problem for a map, or is it a problem for a taxi driver? Because that gets the point across. The taxi driver takes longer to train, needs more experience, but is actually more adaptive, more resilient. Whereas the map user, less time to train, it will diffuse faster, more people can use it, but it's less adaptable when things start to change, and post-COVID, everything is changing. Now, narrative sits as a halfway house between those two, and this is one of the first key things about how you store tacit knowledge, is you store it in the micro-narratives of people's day-to-day experience. So, for example, one of the things we did with the US Army in Afghanistan is we got company commanders to keep their field notes in narrative form so they could speak or take a picture or write or any combination of that. And as long as they did that in real time through multiple observations, they didn't have to write a patrol report at the end of the day. Now, that was really useful for many reasons. One is it gave us real-time military intelligence from multiple observers rather than waiting for reports. But it also captured knowledge at the point of understanding, the point of interpretation, because the way we remember things, even 3 to 4 days, or even 3 to 4 hours in some cases after they happen, is different from the way they actually happen, which is why we talk about lessons learning rather than lessons learned. So capturing people's stories in the field under fire is key. We've just completed another project working with residential care homes for the Dutch government, in which we captured narrative continuously from residents, their relatives, and from medical staff. And that's actually provided much better knowledge management, knowledge understanding, and intervention design than conventional transaction systems, because it's real time, it's ambiguous, it uses not just text, it uses pictures. So a nurse can take a picture of a patient, record a patient's story, write their notes. All of that is what we call a micronarrative. And this is also a large part of what we're now starting to work on more widely on this. And I'll go through a list in a minute. But fundamentally, the way with people with deep expertise communicate their tacit knowledge is through stories. Once you have enough stories, you can start to produce maps or write documents. And of course, what we call narrative enhanced doctrine, which is taking those best practice documents and linking them to people's actual stories, creates enriched context. And once you've done enough of that, you've actually got a tacit knowledge transfer. So without the narrative stage, you can't really make tacit knowledge explicit, or you can't make explicit knowledge come alive. So narrative databases are one of the key missing components, overall within the knowledge firmament at the moment. Is where we focus. So several uses of that. The one I've talked about already, which is lessons learning, not lessons learned. Capturing knowledge in the field as it actually happens. We've done that with engineers in Boeing. We've done it, as I say, with multiple medical projects. We're currently doing it in Australia on massive public transport infrastructure projects, where engineers no longer need to write a report because they're capturing observations and details as they go, including weak signal detection of things that they're nervous about, which might indicate a long-term problem. So this is kind of like real-time, not retrospective. From that, we can also do things like this. This is actually a narrative landscape. This is something where we were looking at different aspects of culture, where we presented the same data to the whole workforce of a company, got them all to interpret that data, and from that we draw one of these maps, which, as you can see, actually shows 3 dominant cultures within the system and allows people to go from a high abstraction representation of the space. I can click anywhere on that framework and read the actual stories. So here we're using visualization to allow people to access stuff in what is called serendipitous discovery. You didn't expect to find things. And this works through a thing we developed. You can look it up on our website, called high abstraction metadata, so that people generally don't know what they need to know until they need to know it, to adapt my second rule. You want people to encounter things in unexpected ways, and that's one of the great advantages of narrative database, because they handle tacit knowledge in a very different way. I talked about narrative enhanced doctrine, and I mentioned several times the essential ambiguity of narrative. If you remove the ambiguity for something, you make it context dependent. If you increase the ambiguity, provided you don't go too far, you make it context independent. And one of the things this also allows us to do, you can see this in the picture I've drawn here, is you can sense patterns beyond that which is explicitly available. One of the famous examples on this is if you give radiologists a batch of X-rays and you ask them to look for anomalies, on the final X-ray, you put a picture of a gorilla, which is 48 times the size of a cancer nodule, then 83% of radiologists will not see it. And the 17% who do come to believe they were wrong when they talk with the 83% who didn't. Well, one of the functions of knowledge management is to find that 17% before they talk to the 83%, And these maps do that. That top right-hand group cluster is actually an anomaly. It's a group of people who are seeing the world differently. So sensing patterns, seeing patterns is a key aspect of this. And that's where one of the things we've now worked on, and this is within the EU Field Guide for Knowledge Management, and you should have the link, the EU Field Guide for Crisis Management and Complexity, is you need to build your employees as a human sensor network so you've got real-time decision support and real-time situational assessment. And that's where we take a Gemba approach on this, which is micro-based capture of experience as it actually happens. So narrative and narrative databases are kind of like one of the key pillars of managing tacit knowledge. The second thing is through informal networks. And informal networks are vital for a company's health. And you can see some differences in that. I interviewed over 100 very senior executives in the sort of post-COVID situation. What they all said they did in a crisis is they fell back to their informal networks with people they trusted, rather than the formal systems and processes, which would be designed for a different context. Now, that can work well, for example, in a country like Singapore, and I've been working with the Singapore government now for well over 20 years, in that everybody does national service, so everybody is connected with everybody else. So their informal networks are very healthy because they're dense and they cross the silos in government. In my own country, the UK, we have a problem because the elite politicians and the elite civil servants all go to the same private schools and a limited number of elite universities. So their networks are not dense enough for them to really understand what's going on. So one of the key things that we start to work on when we build effectively channels for the communication of knowledge, and this is knowledge as a flow, not as a thing. If I go back to one of my papers, Complex Acts of Knowing, which I think is the 10th most cited paper in the field, and we can make sure you have links to that, is it said you have to focus as much on how creating the channels through which knowledge will flow as managing the knowledge directly. Larry Prusak, who was my colleague for years in IBM, famously said, if you have $1 to spend on knowledge management, spend 1 cent on technology and 99 cents on connecting people. Well, informal networks connect people in organizations, and they're also the key way that you actually link silos. You can't get rid of silos in organizations because they work at the right level of abstraction and codification for very rapid communication of ideas between experts. But you can network those silos by putting things across those silos which work differently. And that's where we have a formal method. You can look this up on kinevin.io. All of our methods are open source. Feel free to use them. Entangled Trios works on that basis. So I'll give you a few examples. We put young people in their first year of office in a pair with people within 3 to 5 years of retirement. And then they couple into a trio with somebody in middle management, preferably somebody on the fast track route. And what we actually find is young people interviewing older people capture knowledge which would never be given to consultants or would never be codified in a database. And it really follows this narrative database oral history pattern. And there's a thing I call the grandparent syndrome, in that grandparents will tell things to their grandchildren they won't tell to their children and vice versa, because the power dynamic is different. I've used engineering students from Aberdeen University to capture knowledge from senior engineers for the oil companies in the North Sea, because they represent no management or political threat and they're in training. So the engineers will tell them stories and teach them. And that gives me a much faster, more effective method of capturing knowledge than anything else. So that's one example. We're also now doing this in software development. We're putting young byte programmer together with systems architect, together with user trained to talk to IT people. And we're sending 10 or 15 of those trios into the community to find out what technology could do to make a difference. And then that material gets synthesized and put into the backlog of a technique like Scrum or whatever in terms of software development. So we're creating diversity, and remember 17% don't see a gorilla, 83% don't. By having multiple small groups scanning the system, you actually get better data, better capture. But the key thing about this type of method is if you change the trios every 3 months, within about 18 months, everybody is within 2 degrees of separation of everybody else. So what you've actually built is a very healthy ecosystem, yeah, of connectivity based on working together and trust, which means what you've effectively done is you've created the pipes, the connections through which knowledge can flow. And that actually is more effective under conditions of ambiguity than codify or structuring knowledge. And as I say, there's a paper called Complex Acts of Knowing, which I wrote some time ago, long time ago, actually 20 years, I think, which basically talks about informal communities arising from this type of method and actually managing the environment of informal communities before you create formal communities of practice and so on. So I've really there talked about 2 major things. You know, one is narrative databases, the other is creating informal networks. And by the way, we do those at the society level as well. Teenagers with grandparents coupled with people from local government can generate loads of initiatives which really work at low cost, whereas government programs take too long and take too much time and basically work on the average. This question about context is really important, yeah, within knowledge management. So basically, narrative databases, informal networks, we actually combine the two. So if we're using the trios, they're capturing stories into the Gemba system as they go. And in the newest work we're doing, which if anybody wants to get in contact with me, they're welcome, we're now delegating decision authorities into role combinations. So for example, in a hospital, if a surgeon from one ward agrees with a nurse from a different ward, together with an anonymous third from finance, they're authorized to make quite significant financial decisions without the need for formal planning or control. And what that allows is for knowledge to be deployed in a network basis very quickly, so that more decisions are made very quickly in the field, rather than going through bureaucratic processes, but with full auditability and full transparency. So these things are starting to develop in radically different ways. And of course, key to all of this is kind of like knowing what you know. So one of the most stupid things you can do, and I said this earlier, is to ask people what they know. That's to ask a meaningless question in a meaningless context. And so one of the first bodies of methods I ever created, which we still use today, again, this is in Cynefin.io, which is the open source website, is knowledge mapping, where we use a typology called ASHEN, which I'm going to come on to a second, and I emphasize it as a typology, not a taxonomy. So a taxonomy puts things into boxes with boundaries. A typology recognizes different aspects of a system, but doesn't create the boundaries. Microbiology now is moving away from taxonomies into typologies because things have more in common than we realize. So the way we actually do knowledge mapping, and we focus on middle managers, not senior managers. This is a famous Nanaka quote. He said, you need to do programs middle bottom up. So sell into middle management because they've got the real problems. That will go down to junior staff, and then that will go up to senior management. It's actually very dangerous to be the executive level's pet project. You tend not to survive long on that. So middle bottom up is key. So what we actually do is we map what people know against the problems, the current operational and strategic problems of middle management. And from that, we generate 3 types of project. One is to use existing knowledge to solve current problems. The other is to solve a problem by matching multiple aspects of existing knowledge. And the third is to create knowledge where we don't have it. Again, I blogged on this recently. You can have the links. It's a formal method. Now, the ASHEN framing of this is actually quite important. And we also, by the way, use this for leaders. And ASHEN is a mnemonic. It stands for 5 things. First of all, artifacts. Comes from the Latin artes and facto. So these are things which are man-made. They may be tools, they may be spreadsheets, they may be processes. They're highly explicit, they can be documented, no problem. Then we get skills. I've actually, this is a British habit, rebuilt 3 or 4 houses largely with my own hands. Yeah, I've replumbed them, I've put in central heating, I've rewired them. But only once do I ever try and plaster a wall, and I just don't have the skill. But a plasterer who spent 3 or 4 years training can plaster a room and it'd be perfectly smooth in a couple of hours, whereas it took me 5 days and a sanding machine, and I'm never ever going to do it again. So skills are things where we know how to train people to do it. We know the process of defining whether they got the skill or not. But again, that's more explicit, it's more controllable or manageable. And then we come on to heuristics or habits. The normal English phrase for heuristics is a rule of thumb. So you find that with experts. Yeah, I mean, I remember doing this knowledge mapping in the North Sea again, and I landed on a rig with an engineer who was a troubleshooter. And I remember saying, how are you going to find out what's wrong? And he gave me 5 or 6 of these rules of thumb, like, you know, I heard this noise, or you can see from the color of that flame. Very little heuristics, which actually meant because he built that experience, he could make a decision very quickly. And one of the other things human beings do is we build habits of work. This is also done through apprentice schemes. So effectively, the knowledge is actually hidden in the habit. It's part of the habitual pattern of behavior. And by the way, ethics comes into that as well. So you can see we're now becoming more tacit in the way we think about things. Then there's experience. There's some things you just have to have experience to be able to use them. You can't just come in from scratch and do something. I mean, I say I go walking in the mountains. I didn't realize until I went walking with some friends who'd never walked before that I'm constantly scanning the territory to identify paths before I even get there. And it's a subconscious behavior. It's just something I know to do because I have experience. Yeah. And again, go and talk to older engineers. They make decisions very quickly because they can draw on a huge body of memories. And those memories arise from practical experience rather than from reading books or knowledge management databases. And finally, the catch-all, natural talent. There are some people who are just better at doing things than other people. So the ASHEN question is really useful. So when people make decisions, we say, what artifacts did you use? What skills? What heuristics? What experience? What natural talent? So that allows us, instead of saying, how do I replace Henry, because Henry is a really valuable employee, to say, Henry is this bundle of ASHEN elements. How do I replace that? And of course, that gives me very different strategies. So ASHEN is a really important question because it starts to focus on what can be made explicit and what has to be tacit. And of course, if it's tacit, you either create narrative databases or you build apprentice models, and apprentice models are still one of the most valuable forms of knowledge management we know. So what I've tried to do in this brief presentation is to explain the context of our work on this, and basically to go through 2 primary methods, narrative databases and informal network creation, and then end up with a way of describing what you know in such a way that you don't make this mistake of thinking you can make everything explicit and have everything searched on a knowledge management database. We need to recognize human creativity and human inventiveness is radically different from computers and text-based databases. And one of the roles of knowledge management is to encourage that. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Dave. Thank you for your wonderful sharing about managing tacit knowledge through narrative databases and informal networks. It inspired a lot. And now we come to the Q&A. 那现在呢，我们是问答环节。如果大家有问题的话，可以现在提问。我们 Zoom 里朋友可以直接在聊天框中里把问题打出来，或者是直接可以取消静音，用麦克风发言。那其他平台的朋友可以把问题反馈给我们的工作人员。Hi, Professor. We have questions from the audience on different platforms, and my colleague is collecting them and will put some of them in the chat box.
Cool. I've got it open.
兼顾有问题吗？ Oh, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Very good.
Nice to meet you. It's a pleasure, Professor Snowden, to listen at you, and thank you very much for the global organization of this workshop, which is extremely interesting and fascinating. So my name is Gian Guglielmo Calvi. I'm actually connected from Geneva, Switzerland. where there is quite of a strong knowledge management community. And I'm also part of this Swiss Knowledge Management Forum community. My background is actually that of a computer scientist. So I will go straight forward to the connection between technology and knowledge management, which has been addressed by Professor Snowden already in some points. But one of my concern is how do we ensure indeed that digital transformation, they support knowledge flows. So what are the things not to do in terms of introducing digital innovation, like really the don't, that we have to avoid, that will disrupt eventually even those basic process that some organizations have in places just for the sake of innovation, because we see this more and more at an acceleration pace, which is incredible, introducing also ChatGPT and everything that comes with it. So, and I'm extremely afraid of how to bring this positive transformation that affects knowledge positively. So,
yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. Let me throw out some controversial points. When I was in Geneva a month ago, we worked with the International Red Cross on a lot of this stuff, so it's there. First of all, I would avoid the transformation word.
okay.
It's actually got a really bad history in human system change. We've been trying to transform companies for 50 years now. And if you now say we're running a transformation program, it triggers memories from your employees about all the previous failures. It's like a 2 or 3 year cycle. So from a complexity science point of view, it's much more important to describe the present and identify small changes you can make in the present. We have a whole method you can look up called estuarine mapping, which maps the energy gradients of the system. And the principle is if you make the energy cost of virtue less than the energy cost of sin, things are more likely to happen. So you focus on changing the ecosystem without very specific goals, and that gives you much more flexibility and adaptability within the system. So lots of small things rather than big things. I think the other danger is that people are getting hyped on digitization at the cost of human intelligence. Somebody asked me in California the other day whether I thought computers would exceed humans in intelligence in the next 20 years. And I said yes, because at the moment we're planning to meet them halfway. We're dumbing down human intelligence into information processing. And actually computers are better at that than we are. What we're really good at is seeing novel or unusual connections. So for example, it turns out that painting and music come before language in human evolution. And we actually think the evolutionary reason for that is abstraction, which is what art is, takes you away from the material, so it shortens the distance between things. So you innovate. So you suddenly see novel and unusual connections and you make the association. So for example, when an engineer realized the significance of a chocolate bar melting in their pocket, when they were maintaining a magneto of a radar machine in 1945, they then put a metal box around the magneto, we got microwave ovens. That human ability to see completely unexpected connections between things is something you need to nurture. Some of the work we do with the narrative databases I talked about is to allow abstract clustering of stories. One famous one we did is we put together stories about people's technical capability with customer stories. And we ended up creating a new product, which is an artificial rock for swimming pools and gardens, which changes color based on human proximity and warmth. I mean, I think it's revolting, but it's selling very well. But that's entirely based on a technology originally developed to handle urine-saturated staircases in a football stadium. Now, that's what human beings are good at. And the role of technology is to augment human beings, not to replace them. And the current drive from digitization is destroying analog representation, it's destroying human interaction, and it's costing a lot of money, and it's becoming another fad. Yeah, if we realize the limits of it, we can use it well, but taken to excess, it's a bad idea.
Thank you very much, Professor. It's brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you. 那刚刚就这位朋友他问的问题呢，是他的背景本身是这个大数据这些人工智能、计算机科学方面的背景。那他的问题是关于技术跟知识管理之间的联系。比如说他的问题是我们要如何确保就是这个数字化变革能够有效的支持这个知识的管理以及知识的流动。那在这个过程当中，我们应该去避规哪些风险，就不要去做哪些事情，然后可能会给我们造成一定的风险和担忧。就如何我们能够实现比较积极的这个数字化变革，并且能够有效的去支持这个知识的管理流程。首先呢，第一个问题是，其实关于变革这个词呢，其实就是我们的 Dave 先生他其实不倾向于使用这个词，因为在人类历史上，它其实给我们造成了很多的麻烦。其实我们更多的其实可以专注于当下，就是从当下我们细微的这些变化可以做起。我们可以关注我们身边的这个像这个生态环境系统这些经济系统，而不去专注一个其实大的目标。我们可以从这些小的细微的地方入手，那这样呢也能更加的灵活的去应对这些变化，然后增强我们的适应性，是包括我们对于以往的我们的习得，然后我们学到的东西如何去更好的应用到我们当下所处的环境当中。那第二个，我们可能在这个因为人工智能发展太快了，我们也面临了很多的就是危机，特别是这个计算机以及人类智慧之间的这个话题，这个之间的斗争也是我们经常提到的。像我之前呢也在比如说前几天也谈过这个话题，就是我们人家有人问到，就是是不是说20年以后我们可能计算机它就能够真正的可能取代人类了，就是真正的超越人类了。其实某种程度上它是能做到的，因为计算机它确实是它的表现确实是比我们人能够做得更好，特别是大家随着最近也能看到了，像很多人工智能性的像 Chat GPT 的出现，我们都感受了这方面的危机。那其实我们在就是人类进化过程当中，我们也诞生了很多的创新的比较抽象的一些术，像我们的音乐、绘画，像这些东西呢，我们也通过这些东西，就是我们可以拉近我们人与人之间的距离。那这个呢，在知识转移当中呢，也起到了很好的作用。就像我们前面提到的这个叙事数据库，就是我们通过这样的方式，然后更好的就是将这个知识实现一个转移，实现一个传承。那总的来说呢，就是这个技术呢，它未必会就是能够真正的就是取代我们人类，因为很多方面，特别是我们人与人之间的互动，这个就是计算机技术这些方面的东西，目前还就是无法能够说完全的替代是怎么样的，它还是有一定的局限性的。那更重要的是，我们如何去能够很好的利用这些技术，然后为我们的就是人类，为我们的这个整个知识管理流程，然后能够起一个很好的支持作用。好，谢谢。我们来下一个问题。下一个问题有哪位朋友要问的？
Hi, Professor. My name is Michelle, and I really appreciate you share the great, model. I really like the how to read it, ASHEN, as it really cover a lot of aspect in the company operation. Especially the one you mentioned, the start from the middle and go to the entry and go back up to the executive. My question here is, from your experience, what role the corporate culture impact or play in when you apply this model?
I think it's fairly critical. There's a quote which is misattributed to Peter Drucker. He never actually said it, and I talked with him, which is culture eats strategy for breakfast. Right? But we talk, I don't like words like mindset and mental models because they imply a purely cognitive process, and human decision making is body-based and socially based. So we tend to talk about three things: the level of agency somebody has, what sort of decisions can they actually make? Yeah, the affordances provided by their education, by the company. Yeah. And then this key thing, which is another way of looking at culture, which is called an assemblage. And that's the pattern of micro stories, the pattern of things that you hear around the water cooler, the pattern of stories which are acceptable in your organization. And those represent culture. And it's very rare for an organization as a whole to have a culture. So that narrative map I showed you is actually a culture map. It's done by presenting cartoons to the whole workforce. They choose which cartoon represents the culture. They tell a story about why they interpret it. Then we draw the map. And what that actually shows is there are 4 distinct cultures. It's not for the whole organization. And if I go down or up, the map will look different. And that's where we get into this new theory of change around culture, because I look on the map and I say, how can we create more stories like these and fewer stories like those? Now, that's actually a far more effective mechanism for change than how do we create an entrepreneurial culture, which is just a platitude. It means nothing. So mapping culture and looking at it at different levels. You know, you might have an organizational level culture, but divisions will be different, work groups will be different. And we now map that in real time with the Gemba software. So we can actually show a dashboard for executives which show how their culture is evolving and allow them, again, this principle, micro interventions, not macro interventions. It's also called micro nudging. Yeah, it's not the sort of nudge theory stuff, which is too granular. It's lots of little micro nudges.
Yep. Yeah, thank you. And this is the open, because I'm running a project regarding culture. And so this is a really good angle to look at that. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. 那第二个问题呢，是我们刚才就是教授分享了一个模型，就是 ASHEN 模型。那这个模型呢，就是针对于这个模型，就是我们涉及到Michelle 刚才问的问题是，就是说公司文化，就是在公司文化当中，就是这个模型它能起到就是什么样的作用，它能够就是带来什么样的影响？你知道在对于这个公司文化方面，然后就是刚刚教授他提到了就是3个非常重要的点。首先第一个点就是关于就是你的一个能动性的一个水平，因为关于你其实可能在组织里可能作为一个个人，你的行动、你的动机、你的主观能动性，那这个呢可能受你的就是教育背景影响，或者说你在公司里的工作经验或者各种方面的影响。那这个呢，对就是公司的文化战略是推动文化这个氛围是起着非常大的作用的。那第二个呢，是可以就是我们通过一种方式，就是绘制你的一个文化地图。那这个文化地图它也是就像我们的那个叙事数据库一样，它是带有叙事性质的。你可以比如说就是画一些卡通的这个画，你可以比如说通过哪一幅卡通你觉得可以就是代表你们公司的文化，你可以去就是大家可以坐在一起去讨论，就是什么样的可能图形能够代表你的公司的文化，然后你把它就是画下来，然后或者说你可以，然后通过这个图形呢，你可以就是讲述哪些故事，那哪些故事是你们就是愿意是更多的去分享的，那也哪些故事呢，也是你们可能想规避的，就通过这样比较生动的方式把这个文化的这个地图然后绘制出来。那第3个呢，它也是我们刚刚提到了一个就是微观的一个概念，就是我们文化因为也是需要是慢慢培养形成的，有可能就是说一下子就好像形成了可能有一个地形，那就是在慢慢改变过程当中呢，我们通过那些就是微观的一些方法，然后形成这样的文化战略，这样的文化氛围。好，就还有其他的朋友有问题吗？Hi, Professor. There is a question, and I put it in the chat box.
Yeah, it's a good question again, right? Yes, I think it is. I mean, the reality is, if you invent something, all right? Particularly if you're an inventor, you're creating new knowledge. Then you have to make people aware of it, but it's still, it's like a, I've had 2 children, I'm about to be a grandfather. It's like a 2 or 3 year old, all right? And it's precious to you and you don't want it abused. And the trouble is, in most large corporates, there are actually vultures who sort of hang around waiting to find a new idea and will grab it off people and then claim the credit if it works and blame you if it didn't. Now, I may be biased by having worked for IBM for 7 years, but that was the culture in IBM. So you learned very fast to only share new ideas with people you really trusted until they were mature enough. Yeah. So it wasn't that you didn't want to share, but you didn't want abuse. And when IBM tried to, I'll tell you the story on this. So that they insisted I share my knowledge in the community of practice. And they made it linked to my bonus. Well, by that time I had a teenage daughter. And if you have teenage daughters, you need bonuses to keep them happy, right? But I didn't want to share with everybody. So I wrote an academic paper. Most words had 15 syllables. It was obscure. I put it on the community of practice. Yeah, I'd shared my knowledge, but in a way that nobody could actually use it without coming to me first. Right? And I think that concept of trusting, that's why we emphasize informal networks, because informal groups have very high trust and people will share within that. And then you have to trigger to get them to volunteer when they're ready to share it more widely. If you try and force them, it's actually a mistake.
Thank you. 那第3个问题呢，是我们刚刚就是教授分享的时候提到一个，就是对于专家的知识保留这个问题。因为很多专家其实在分享知识过程当中，他可能会对对方有所保留，因为他有一种担心，他担心他的知识被滥用了。那这种情况是不是说在今天很多组织当中也依然存在？那答案呢是的，特别是因为当你比如说发明出新的知识的时候，你可能会就想让别人也是去意识到，你也可能有一种去欲望也跟别人分享，但是呢，你会有一种担忧，就是这种知识是不是说使别人给正确的人，然后他是否是正确的使用了？那我在 IBM 的时候，当时也是的，就是当时公司呢也是坚持让我去，可能在公司的一个可能形成的一个社群里，然后坚持让我去分享那知识，但是我自己呢，其实并不想去跟每一个人分享。然后呢，我的方法是，然后我就写了一篇文章，就是把我的这个观点知识都写在这篇文章里。但这个文章它有就是一个比较特别的地方，就是那些真正想运用到就是我的这个知识的人，他要想学会用的话，他必须先来找我，就是跟我先来交流，这样交流一下我们的这个想法观点。那这个就再延伸到了我们刚才提到的这个非正式网络的这个话题。因为非正式网络呢，它是建立在高度信任的基础上的，因为在人与人之间建立了这个高度信任的基础之上，然后才愿意去更加比如说甚至毫无保留的去分享自己的知识。所以这种情况确实是存在的，只是说大家可以就是相对就是辩证性的去看待，然后是如何把你的这个专家的知识如何分享给就是正确的人，然后让他能够去正确的使用。Thank you, Professor, for your wonderful sharing. I think that's all for today's the Q&A, and that's all for today's webinar.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And now let me share my screen and we'll watch the feedback from the audience. 非常感谢大家今天参与我们的讲座，然后我们也希望得到大家的反馈。如果大家有任何就是对我们讲座有任何反馈意见的话，可以扫右下方的2维码，然后回答里面的一些问题，然后给我们一些意见。下期的讲座预告是在4月3号的下午4点到5点，是由来自以色列的就是隐性知识专家ASHEN博士来分享的。他曾经是以色列总理办公室的就是首席知识管理官，他给我们带来的话题是用剥洋葱的方式来深度解密隐性知识。感兴趣的朋友可以扫右方的2维码报名参加我们 这下一期的讲座。最后我们跟大家分享的消息是在今年的9月3号到5号，在瑞士达沃斯，我们即将举办第2届组织隐形技能管理论坛。关于这个论坛更多的信息，大家可以点击右下方我们官方网址 www.GO-TKM.org。那这里不仅有论坛的信息，组织隐形技能管理系列讲座的信息，包括我们组织隐形技能管理专家的信息。好，今天的讲座就到这里，非常感谢大家的参与，我们下期再见。